talk a little bit about the passage that we just read. And I want to do it through the lens of a midrash, in the midrash Ne'elam, which is a mystical text associated with the Zohar, but was brought by Menachem of Chernobyl in his book Meor Einayim. He was one of the earlier great Hasidic masters. And what he says is, Avraham is the soul, and Lot is the Yetzer Hara, the evil urge. As the tzaddik, the righteous one, ascends from rung to rung, the Yetzer Hara goes up along with him. This is actually his commentary on Lech Lecha, right? When Abraham responds to Lech Lecha call, and Lot went with him. The greater a person is, the greater the Yetzer Hara. So this is sort of a classic Hasidic move. To read biblical figures not as actual individual people, but as sort of allegorical figures representing something. And it's a classic Hasidic move also in the sense of the introjection of it, right? The taking of something outside of us and saying, no, it's actually inside you, right? Lot is not some figure out there, the bad person that we're seeing. He's a part of ourselves. Right? We might even read this through the lens of family systems theory, right? That sort of the problem child in the family, in this case, the nephew, right, is actually playing out aspects of the parents, right? He's embodying some part of them. So Lot, I want to invite us to think about, is the Yetzer Hara to Abraham's neshama, to Abraham's soul. He's the dark side. Now, the Yetzer Hara, the tendency to do bad, right? The evil impulse. What exactly is the Yetzer Hara, right? What are we talking about? What do we know about the Yetzer Hara? So what do we know about Lot? Who is Lot? What have we seen about him? So we are introduced to Lot at the end of Parshat Noach in Genesis 11, when we get the genealogy, and we learn that Terach is the father of three sons, Avram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran is the father of Lot. That's how we know that Lot is Abraham's nephew. What do we know about that side of the family? Haran dies young. Haran died in the presence of his father, meaning in his father's lifetime. But the Midrash imagines a whole story here about Haran and what it means that he died in his father's presence. And here's what the Midrash imagines. It's Bereshit Rabbah 38:13. They imagine that Terach, Abraham's father, denounced him before Nimrod for having smashed the idols, right? Terach is an idolater. Abraham smashes his father's idols, famous story in the Midrash, not in the Torah itself. And Terach reports him to Nimrod. Nimrod cast Abraham into the fiery pit. This is a play on the place name Ur-Kasdim, where they're from. Ur is like fire, right? So he casts him into a fiery pit. And Haran, Abraham's brother, is sitting on the side, and he's saying to himself, I'm going to wait and see what happens. If Abraham prevails, I'm on Abraham's side. If Nimrod prevails, I'm on Nimrod's side. Naturally, Avram is saved. They go to Haran and they say, and you? And he says, I'm with Abraham. And they cast him into the furnace and he dies. Right? And that's the story of Haran, Lot's father. So what's the origin story here of the Yetzer Hara? It comes from a place of a lack of moral commitment and a lack of moral clarity, right? A failure to discern. I'm just out to save myself, right? Whoever wins, I'm with them. And also it emerges from a place of trauma. Right? This is actually a very horrible story, this little midrash here, associated, by the way, with the Akedah, I think, presaging the Akedah, which is at the end of the parsha. We didn't read it this morning, right? A father who turns his son in. And then, like Nimrod, right? An oppressor who is threatening to kill us, right? So that's Lot's origin story, according to the midrash. That's one thing we know about the Yetzer Hara. The next thing, so, okay, Lech Lecha, Lot goes with Abraham, chapter 12, and then we have chapter 13. And in chapter 13, we discover that Avram and Lot have each become very wealthy. They have lots of flocks and herds. And it turns out that the herdsmen start quarreling with each other, and they can't live together. So what happens? Avram says, you pick your direction and I'll go the other way. Now, what is the fight about? The midrash here, let me read it to you. Sorry, give me 1 second. Rashi brings the midrash from Breshit Rabbah as follows. There was quarreling because Lot's shepherds were wicked and would graze their cattle in the fields of others. Right? They would let their cattle steal grazing land, essentially. And Avram's shepherds would rebuke them over the theft. And Lot's shepherds would say, the land has been given to Avram, and he has no heir, so Lot will inherit him, and so technically it's not theft. But the verse says, the Torah text goes on to say, and the Canaanite and the Perizzites were then dwelling in the land, i.e., Avram had not yet come into possession of it. That's the story, okay? And then, after this fighting, and Abraham says, we'll go our separate ways, you pick your direction, I'll go the other way, Lot chooses the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because it was lush, well-watered land. It was great grazing ground, and it was Sodom and Gomorrah was an especially wealthy area. So that's what he chooses, even though at that point, the Torah tells us very explicitly in chapter 13, verse 13, the people of Sodom were evil and sinful to Adonai me'od. This is a very corrupt, evil society already, but Lot chooses it because it's an easy path to wealth and it's a good, easy place to live. So now we know two other things about Lot. We know that he and his shepherds overreach and they make excuses for behavior that is wrong, right? A little sophistry. Well, technically, it's really our land already because eventually it will be because, right? Even though it is not their land. And we know that he values ease and beauty and luxury and the lushness over the place, over ethics and justice. That's the next thing we know. Then we move on, and in chapter 14, while Lot is living in Sodom, we learn that he and all of his stuff is taken captive in war, in the war of the 4 kings against the 5, and Avram intervenes and rescues him and all his property. And we know at that point that Avram already, the soul, is sensitive to the sinfulness of Sodom. And when the king of Sodom comes and offers reward, Abraham says, absolutely not. He makes a really big point of this. I am taking nothing from you. No one will ever say that Abraham became rich off Sodom. Not even a thread or a shoe strap will I take from you, right? When he rescues his nephew. And what happens then with Lot? We actually lose track of him for a while. Torah doesn't say. The Torah goes on to focus on Abraham. We get the covenant between the pieces in chapter 15. We get the birth of Yishmael in chapter 16. We get the covenant of circumcision in chapter 17. Avram becomes Avraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. And then we have the beginning of our parsha, which I already mentioned in chapter 18, in which Avram welcomes the guests, etc., 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 right? And the whole arguing with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. And where is Lot all this time? It is only in the chapter that we read, only in chapter 19, that we learned for the first time that Lot has actually returned to live in Sodom. Despite it having proven dangerous and him having needed to be rescued, the draw of going back is too great, and he has returned and he lives there again. So now we know about Lot that he is someone who doesn't learn from past errors, right? He returns to associate with immorality even after experiencing the cost. Maybe he thinks, I can handle it, right? I won't be affected by it. I won't get drawn into it. I can deal with it. But he does not learn from his past errors. Okay, so here's what we know. If we are imagining Lot as the Yetzer Hara, according to the Midrash HaNe'elam and the Me'or, here's what we know about the Yetzer Hara. One, it is often associated with or playing out the effects of some trauma. That's often part of its origin story. Two, the Yetzer Hara has trouble making firm moral commitments. It's transactional. It has a kind of wait and see who wins attitude, right? Whatever it takes to survive, rather than a priori commitments from a moral and ethical perspective. There's a kind of lack of moral clarity. Three, it values ease and luxury over justice and ethics, money over good neighbors. What's the best neighborhood? The most expensive, not the one with really good neighbors. Four, it cuts ethical corners and makes excuses and specious rationalizations. It's not really theft because technically I can argue it, right? And five, it has trouble learning from past mistakes and tends to retrench, even when past decisions have proven really dangerous and put the soul at risk. That's what we know. Now, I want to say that sometimes the evil urge sounds to me like a very strong word for the Yetzer Hara, right? I don't think we need to think about the Yetzer Hara as like evil writ large in that sense. It's all the little moral compromises that we make, the small justifications, the tensions that we have, and the power of the Hasidic reading here is that no one is exempt, right? And it doesn't make us bad people, right? It's not setting Lot up as the worst person who ever lived. That's not what it's doing. It's saying that we all have a Yetzer Hara, right? And literally, the period where Lot disappears from the narrative that I outlined, I think it suggests to us the way the integration of the neshama and the Yetzer Hara within good people, within the figure of Abraham, right? Abraham, during that period of time, does some pretty great things. There are moments of grand moral nobility. And there are also some pretty questionable behavior, right? He's not perfect during that period. He's not a bad person, but we don't have any perfect figures in the Torah. And we see during that time a lot of doubt, questioning God, right? God says, you will have a son to inherit. And he says, would that Yishmael would inherit, right? I don't really, not taking that so seriously. And he's kind of clueless and weak with regard to Sarah, his wife. Like he doesn't really see her. And not to mention, of course, the mistreatment of Hagar, which he just tolerates, right? He's not evil, but he's not perfect. And we're not learning about Lot. We're seeing that kind of integration in one person. And then there is what I think is an absolutely brilliant literary device in the Torah. The literary structure here is magnificent. Because then what happens? Then what happens is we get the beginning of chapter 18. I'm going to read it to you. The beginning of chapter 18 is about Abraham welcoming guests. Adonai appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it please you, don't go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, recline under the tree. Let me fetch a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves, and then go on, seeing that you have come your servant's way." And they replied, "Do as you have said." And Abraham rushed into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seah of choice flour, knead and make cakes." And then he ran to the herd, and he took a calf, tender and choice, the best that he had, and he gave it to the servant boy, who hastened to prepare it. And he took curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, and he set these before them, and he waited on them under the tree as they ate. Right? This is the model of Abraham as welcoming guests, hachnasat orchim, right? This is the model of zrizut in observing a mitzvah. He goes out to greet them. He runs here, he runs there. He's like, all he wants to do is make these guests feel so welcome. It's beautiful, right? And it's the model for so much of our mitzvot. And I want to say, by the way, even the Midrash goes so far as to say, because the text references that God appeared to him, and then Abraham sort of turns to these guests, the Midrash says that imagines Abraham saying to God, basically, could you just hold on one second, because I have to do this mitzvah, right? And welcoming guests is a higher mitzvah than being present to God and welcoming the presence of Shekhinah. It's one of the texts that teaches us that the ethical mitzvot take priority over the ritual mitzvot. Beautiful. Okay, chapter 18. Chapter 19, I'm going to read it to you in the English. The 2 angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, and as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to greet them, and bowing low with his face to the ground, he said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house to spend the night and bathe your feet. Then you may be on your way early." But they said, No, we will spend the night in the square. But he urged them strongly. So they turned his way and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. They had not yet laid down when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last one, all of them gathered about the house, and they shouted to Lot, and they said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may be intimate with them, that we may rape them." So Lot went out to them to the entrance, shut the door behind him, and said, "I beg you, my friends, don't commit such a wrong. Look, right? You can't do this." So far, so good. He sounds just like Abraham. It's a beautiful thing, right? He's welcoming the guests. No, you have to come. Let me feed you. I'm going to bake matzah for you. I'm going to wash your feet. And he's willing to risk himself and protect them against the townspeople, right? And then verse 8. "Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do to them as you please. But do not do anything to these men, since they have come under the shelter of my roof." Sorry. That's how you feel. It's what you feel, right? You feel like doing that. Full stop. Cue the cartoon screeching of the wheels, right? The record needle going, like, what the hell? What is that? Are you kidding me? Where did that come from? Right? I think the Torah is intending for us to have that reaction, and literally, they are teaching us the most important lesson about the Yetzer Hara, which is that sometimes it looks and sounds exactly like the Yetzer HaTov, the neshama, right? It's cloaked in the language of righteousness and justice and compassion and love and doing a mitzvah, and it looks the same. And you don't really know that the Yetzer Hara is operating within the goodness that is happening there. And there is goodness that is happening there, right? It's not that the Yetzer HaTov isn't there. It's not that the neshama isn't there. It's just hand in glove with a lot of other stuff that we are not noticing. And then suddenly, one sees or says or does something utterly horrifying. What the hell? Where did that happen? Right? It teaches us, I think, something else that we learn about the Yetzer Hara, which is one way to understand the way the Yetzer Hara is functioning here is that the tool that it's using is gross moral oversimplification. How does Lot here get sort of, how does the Yetzer Hara act? How is he getting sucked into it? It's a refusal and an inability to hold competing obligations and values. You can almost hear Lot, right? The mitzvah is hachnasat orchim, caring for strangers. The mitzvah is welcoming guests, welcoming guests, welcoming guests, welcoming guests. Like that's the thing. That's it. I'm going to look with tunnel vision at that particular mitzvah. Nothing else matters. The guests are vulnerable strangers. They need my protection. That's the mitzvah. No one else counts. Right? The Yetzer Hara doesn't like to do a lot of work of moral discernment and holding complexity. Right? It's a little bit lazy. And so it uses a mitzvah. One mitzvah, we're going to lift that up over everything and nothing else matters. So I have to say that this reading has been utterly haunting me all month. Especially as I think about college campuses and I think about what I have to believe, what I know in my heart are otherwise like a lot of basically good kids on college campuses, social justice warriors, committed to equality and inclusion, totally unaware that of the role of the Yetzer Hara that is thoroughly intertwined in what's going on here. Right? Not everyone. I'm not naive. And I know that there is real anti-Semitism on college campuses. It's real, it needs to be dealt with. Bracket that for a minute, because I think that's really the minority. What I think is the majority are kids who are kind of swept away by a social justice movement that seems right, that is part of their social circle, that lifts up trauma, that comes from trauma, but that lacks a kind of moral clarity and has an inability and an unwillingness to hold complexity, that cuts some corners and engages in rationalizations, that chooses the comfort of the group over the hard discernment and the courage to forge one's own way. And then suddenly, what the hell? People are calling for the death of all Jews? What? People are saying it's totally fine what happened on October 7th, it's justified? I have to believe, I pray, I have to believe that many, many kids on these campuses are now sitting and saying, wait, what? How did this get to that? And they're hurting and they're lonely. Again, I'm not naive, right? It's not like I think everyone is going through this moral crisis, but I have to believe a lot of kids are. And it's a time, therefore, such an important time for moral education and for education about some of the sort of simplistic, theories that have been on campus to explain the whole world in terms of colonizer and colonized and people of color who are oppressed and white oppressors. And right, there's a certain, you can hear the sort of, welcoming guests. Well, like that's the thing. There's a victim and there's right? And it's a similar kind of thing. We need the education. They don't need doxing and public shaming. That's not going to help anything. They need education. And that includes a lot of Jewish kids on campus, right? There are a lot of Jewish kids for whom this is that what the hell moment. And they're terrified and they're lonely and they don't know how to make sense of what's going on. And I want to say that some of them have been pushed to where they are into the arms of kind of anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic groups by the organized Jewish community, who presented them for years with a false dichotomy of loyalty to Israel or adherence to a lot of the ethical principles that Judaism has taught them. I had a conversation with a neighbor in my hall this week who has 2 kids in college and was telling me about the friend of one of her sons who is, you know, in the sort of the Jewish Voices for Peace camp, right? That you know, basically, you know, anti-Zionist, and said to me, you know, that part of the problem for this kid is that his mother is so kind of narrowly pro-Israel that he can't talk to her. And so he says to her son, like, I can't talk to my parents. That's tragic. Because this is a kid now who has no one to guide him, who has no one to help him figure out, how did these people who you thought were morally right end up with this moment of, like, kill all the Jews, right? That it's tragic. Now, if it sounds like I am letting these kids off the hook too easily, especially the groups on campus who are absolutely blatantly, explicitly, in a deep-seated way, anti-Semitic, I am not. That's not my intent at all, right? They need to be called to account, and we need to stop actual hate on campus, right? Anti-Semitism is unacceptable, Islamophobia is unacceptable, all of that. I commend to you, some of us may have seen this, I know Mark saw it, the letter that several law firms sent to about several of the top law firms in the country, Neil knows this as well, to the deans of various law schools, saying, you know, calling on them to educate their students to be able to engage in even emotionally charged discussions in a productive, healthy way without hatred, because it will not be tolerated at the law firms who are recruiting there. It's a beautiful letter. It's really like rising to the occasion and stepping up. And I think responding to that what the hell moment where we realize, wait a second, like, what's going on here? So I am not at all excusing the worst of it, A, and B, remember the point of the whole Hasidic notion that Abraham is the neshama and Lot is the Yetzer Hara. The whole point of it is that it's not about us and them, it's about us and us, right? It's about what's in here. And I have to also clarify before I go further, I am in no way, in any possible universe, justifying anything that Hamas did or says or its mission or anything about who they are, right? They are so far beyond the Yetzer Hara. Like, that's not what we're talking about, okay? That's just Ra, right? That's evil. Take that out. But we also have to look at the ways that we have been and are co-opted by the Yetzer Hara, and the danger of it happening constantly. Not because we're terrible people or because we're to blame or we're like, but because we're human people. And human people get co-opted by the Yetzer Hara. And our goodness gets intertwined with the not so good. As individuals and as a nation, in all of the ways that the Yetzer Hara finds its power and functions and is driven, right? The playing out of past trauma, the excuses and the overreaching and the equivocation and the oversimplification, and the lifting up of one mitzvah to the extent, to the detriment of all the others, the choosing of a way that was revealed to be really physically and spiritually dangerous, because we know it, and we're going to go back there. We also need to be on guard for those, wait, what? Moments. We're saying what is okay? We're looking away from what? We're siding with who? Right? We also are susceptible to that. And that, I think, is the great power of this Hasidic reading, is precisely taking us out of the tendency to divide the world so neatly between the good people and the bad people. Right? It's the whole Hasidic frame is based in this notion that there are the tzaddikim. There are 36 of them in the world. Most of us aren't among them. There are the reshaim. There are the people who we might say are beyond hope, right? God looks and says, no, there aren't enough righteous people to save this particular city. There is no hope for Sodom. Hamas is in that category. And then there are the Beinonim, the middling folk, pretty much everyone, who have a Yetzer HaTov, who have a soul, and who have a Yetzer Hara. We're drawn to all of the problems we talked about, right? And this reading is pushing us to look at that, to look at the good and bad within basically good people, right? It will not help us in this moment to pretend that we are entirely innocent, that we never do anything wrong. That's not helpful. It's also not helpful for us to start fighting among each other and point fingers at other Jews and say, you're bad and you're disloyal and you're immoral and you're this, like that will not help us either. None of that is helpful. What will help us is really being discerning and really owning that we're really good people. There's so much good here. And we're not perfect people. And we have to be responsible and careful to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable for the things that are not so good, and discerning as much as we can and separating out. What's the Yetzer HaTov? Where is the Yetzer Hara?